So just like to welcome you all, and I'd just like to welcome you all to the third EALTA webinar. This is a series of webinars that we started having at EALTA. We're planning to have about 2 or maybe more webinars per year. But this is the third. We usually try to do them on topics which are of general interest. General interest to the language assessment community. So far we've had topics suggested by EALTA members according to the survey. So I don't know if any of you were a part of Norman Verhelst's sessions on CTT and IRT statistics in language assessment. Today we've got a slightly different kind of topic. Today's topic is on rating scales with integrated tasks. So I'll introduce myself and our speaker today. My name is Richard Spivey, as you know from the emails that I've been sending around, and I'm the EALTA webinar coordinator. I'm also a test development researcher at the British Council, and I've been an EALTA member for many years. You might have seen me around at conferences and SIG meetings, perhaps. Now, today, what we're going to do is we're going to have, I'm going to hand over to Sathena in a couple of minutes, and she's going to present on scales in integrated skills, and she'll talk for about 45 minutes. And we have a question and answer session at the end of that. In order to put forward a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which is next to the chat button. And I can see I'm being distracted by everybody's chat messages, which are jumping up in front of me. So very nice for everybody to be on board from Oslo, Barcelona, Greece, lots and lots of different places. That's fantastic. So again, welcome to you all. So send your Q&A, your questions using the Q&A function. If you have any other requests or anything you'd like to share, please use the chat function as well. I'd just like to remind you before we start, this is my first webinar hosting, and also our first webinar using this Zoom technology, which many of you may be familiar with, but we're using it for the first time. So please forgive us in advance for any technical snags that may come up during the time. So I'm going to hand over in a minute to Sathena. Dr. Sathena Chan is our speaker today. She is Senior Lecturer in Language Assessment at CRELA. That's the Centre for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment at the University of Bedfordshire. At CRELA, she's worked as a consultant on a variety of test development and validation projects in the UK and around the world. Now, she'll be talking today about some of her major areas of research. That's integrated reading into writing assessment and rating scale development. But she also has a keen interest in things such as test development and validation, cognitive processing, language use, criterial analysis of written performance, and statistical analysis as well. And in all of these areas, Sathena is widely published and is a regular presenter at major international conferences, EALTA, LTRC, ALTE. You may have seen her at one of these conferences. And she's also a regular contributor to EALTA. And if you're lucky, you may have attended one of her pre-conference workshops at EALTA. So she's a very busy person. So let's, with all those things, activities that she does. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sathena Chan, and I will hand over to you now for your session. Thank you, Sathena.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to share with you some of my experiences of developing rating skills for integrated assessment tasks. And I hope all of you can see this, the PowerPoint slides. So first of all, I'll give you an outline of today's talk about what we're going to look at in the coming 45 minutes or so. So first of all, I'm going to give you some definitions and some of the examples of integrated assessment tasks. And then we will look at some important considerations that we have to bear in mind when we develop a rating scales for integrated tasks. These include, for example, the characteristics of the test we are working with and the target construct that the test is targeting to measure. What kind of rating approach are we going to use? How do we translate the construct into descriptors, and how will the score be reported? And lastly, we'll also talk about how we can conduct trials or pilots to collect evidence to validate the rating scales, and how we make use of these details to improve our rating scales. And as Richard said, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So first of all, here are some definitions of reading into writing tasks or integrated tasks. So the first one is from the perspective of pedagogical perspectives. So reading into writing tasks can refer to those instructional tasks that combine reading and writing for different educational purposes, for example, reading to learn. And in the perspective of language testing, integrated task or integrated tests usually refer to a test that integrates reading with writing by having the examiners to read and respond to one or more source texts. And we have a more detailed defined definition at the bottom here. So reading into writing task or integrated task is a task which requires students to produce a writing which displays uses and some orientations to the sources, both conceptually in terms of the meaning and also textually in terms of the language. So some of the common integrated tasks that we usually see include the following. For example, a summary task where we ask students to summarize the main ideas from one single passage or multiple passages. And very often we expand the summary task into something we call a response essay task, where we ask students to summarize ideas from reading or listening input. And then they have to give their own interpretation of the summary by providing a solution. And then another type is what we call a situation-based integrated writing task. And usually in this kind of task, a problem or an issue is presented. And then we require students to make use of multiple sources in order to provide a solution to solve this, the problem. And the last type is a task that we ask students to transform information from graphs. So you can see some of these tasks to be used in some of the standardized language tests, which most of us are familiar with. The first one is the TOEFL IBT tests. So that in their integrated task, they ask students to write an essay based on reading as well as listening inputs in about 20 minutes, and they're expected to summarize the points made in the lecture. On top of that, they have to make connections between the ideas in the lecture and the ideas in the reading inputs. Another example is a test called GEPT, developed by LTTC in Taiwan. So this is a C1 test. So this task requires students to write an essay based on 2 reading articles. So they have to summarize the main ideas from both articles and make their own point of view based on the ideas in the both articles. And the last example is a test called Integrated Skills of English by Trinity College London. And in this test, students are asked to write an essay by using information from 4 texts, 3 of which are written and 1 is nonverbal input, like for example diagram or a picture. So they have to make use of the information from the 4 texts to write about an issue and provide some solutions. So if you are interested in these examples, you can go to the link to see the actual tasks from their website. Okay, so how do we usually develop a rating scale for a writing task? So in the past, people tend to use something called an armchair approach, where like experienced teachers or language developers, they sit down on an armchair and then make some intuitive judgments based on mostly their own experience. So they would decide how many levels or how many descriptors do we need based on their own experiences. But I think the field has really moved on to something called like a mixed methods approach when developing rating scales, where we need to collect different kinds of theoretical and empirical evidence in order to construct or reconstruct if you're working to improve a rating scale, an existing rating scale. And one important aim is to collect these different sources of evidence to describe the different levels of performance. So today we will look at some of the evidence that we need to collect in order to build into our processes of developing a rating scale for integrated tasks. So these are some of the important considerations we need to bear in mind. So first of all, what are the characteristics of the test? What is the purpose of the test? How does the test look like? Who are the stakeholders? And what is the construct being measured by the test in terms of the task features as well as the cognitive processes that students need to use? And what rating approach should we use? Is it a holistic one, analytic one? Is it going to be human scored or machine scored or combination of some of these options? And how many levels do we need? How many bands do we need? And how will the scores be reported? And how will the scores be used? And lastly, how do we validate our rating scale and improve it? So today we will look into each one of these in the context of integrated assessment. So first of all, characteristics of the test. As I said, we have to consider the purpose of the test, whether it's a proficiency test or it is a diagnostic test. How many levels are we working with? Is it just one level or a multiple levels test? How does the test look like? Who are the stakeholders? So here I'm going to draw on some examples from my previous projects of developing rating scales for integrated tasks. The first example is the ISC test that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. So I was involved in a project to revise the rating scale for the ISC tasks. So based on discussions with different stakeholders, we have come up with different aims for the development project. So one of the aims was to develop analytic criteria which address the integrated reading and writing abilities assessed on, well, which are not assessed on the independent tasks, because the test has two tasks, one independent and one integrated. So we need analytic criteria to separate the skills. And one of the features of the test is that it's a suite of different consists of a suite of different levels from ISC Foundation 1 to 3. And for the scaling descriptors, for each of the category, there are 4 possible bands. I will give you a little bit more information about the different bands and what they represent in a minute. So here are some of the features of the examination we have to bear in mind when we develop the rating scale. For example, ISC is a high stakes test. In other words, the results are going to be used for visa application purposes. So there is a high expectation of the validity and reliability of the test. And these are different stakeholders of the test: Trinity, the test provider, the test takers, the teachers. So they have different expectation of the test or what the test can do. And it's important to incorporate different opinions when we develop a rating scale. And then we also have to consider how the score is going to be reported, and we have to consider like some of the test technical aspect, how they have, for example, Trinity has their own technical team to take care of the score reporting, but this may not be the case in your local context. And I'm going to also draw on an example of quite a different scenario. This is another project that I'm working on. So this is a test for our own university, a test to develop to offer prompt assessment and targeted intervention for our students. So after the student has been admitted to our university, we would like to offer them an assessment so that we can identify their needs of academic writing skills. So this test is going to be used within the university, so it has to be practical, cost effective, and the test is tailored to assess the language related, especially the academic study skills. And the results or the scores has to link to targeted support for students. So these are some of the features of the UOB test. So it is a C1 level test post-university entry, and it is low stakes because the decisions made based on test scores are, for example, what kind of support students are going to receive. And the different stakeholders of this test include the university, the students, the lecturers who are going to teach these students, and also the language center who is going to provide the support. And how do we want to report the scores? So how will the scores be used? So in the later slides, I will make reference to these 2 examples. So it's important to bear in mind the features of these 2 texts so that you will be able to see the differences when we work with different scenarios. Okay, so after you have some idea of the characteristics of the test you're working for or you're developing the rating scales for, it's important to consider the construct being measured by the test in terms of like the features and also the cognitive processes that students have to use. So in terms of integrated assessment tasks, these are some of the features, if you like, that we have to specify when we develop a reading to writing tasks. For example, all these features would have an impact on the performance and therefore have an impact on how the rating scale would look like. For example, how long is the test? What topic domain students are going to work with? what are the genres, and what is the scope of the expected interaction between input and output. Are you asking students just to, for example, just to reorder some ideas, or you're asking them to summarize? And what are the language functions you expect students to perform? And we also have to look at the features of the input text you provide student. So for example, is it just one single text or multiple texts? What are the genres students are expected to work with? Would there be any non-verbal input like diagram, tables? What are the discourse modes students are expected to work with? So is it argumentative text or informative texts? So all these features would have an impact on students' performance. Therefore, it's important that we have an idea of these features when we develop the rating scales. So in addition to the features of the task, we also need to know the processes you expect students to work with in your tasks. So one very useful external references you can use is the CEFR descriptors. So they have different scales on different skills. So out of the 12 scales on reading and writing, 4 of them make references to integrated use of skills. So if you're interested, you can refer to these scales, and I'm going to show you the scale of processing text in a minute, because it is most relevant to today's webinars. And you may also check the interaction scales on speaking. Even though we're not talking about speaking today, you may want to look at it if this is something you have to work with in your local context. So if you refer to the processing text scale of the CEFR, you can see that they describe what we expect students to be able to do at different CEFR level. For example, from A1, students are able to copy out, for example, single words or short texts, or to pick out or to reproduce some keywords. But when they progress to B levels, they should be able to start collating ideas, short pieces of information. They should be able to start paraphrasing some passages. And then when they move to B2, they will be able to start summarizing ideas. And when they move on, progress to C levels, then they should be able to summarize long and demanding texts from different sources. So it's quite useful to make reference to these when you are defining the construct of your text. And then, and also is in the context of reading into writing task, these are some of the main processes that we expect students to perform on a reading into writing task. So these include, for example, conceptualization, how students understand the demands of the task, how they conduct micro-plan to fulfill the purpose of the task, how they construct meaning from selecting ideas from the sources, how they connect ideas from multiple texts, and how they transform the organization from the sources into their own writing organization, and how they transform the language used in the sources to their own language by, for example, paraphrasing, by summarizing. And lastly, monitoring and revising processes. So these are the common constructs that a reading into writing task aims to measure. So you may have different emphasis in your local, in the test that you're working with. But the question here is, okay, we have defined the features and the processes of the test. How do we translate these into the rating scale? Because if we can't do that, the students' performance won't be able to measure it. So how do we do that? There are different scoring approaches you can consider using it. For example, holistic, analytic, human score, or machine scored. So for holistic scale, usually we give a single score to the written performance as a whole. If it is an analytic, we will give student a single score for each rating category, and student would, which in other words, student would receive different scores for their piece of performance. So obviously there are different advantages and disadvantages of using either the holistic and analytic scales. And in some way, which one you decide to use based on the feature of the test and the needs of the stakeholders. That's why at the beginning of this, I explained I gave two examples of two different scenarios of integrated tests. So for example, for holistic scales is efficient because raters only need to give one scale. However, it may be less reliable. Analytic scales are useful, especially if you need to provide diagnostic information for your students, but is more expensive because it's more time consuming. So it all depends on the test that you're working with. What are the needs of the test? But no matter which one you choose, either holistic or analytic, it's important that the rating scales should measure the construct that your test is aiming to test and provide a work definitions. So what does that mean? So the rating scales needs to account for the transformation we expect students to do in integrated tasks, because in integrated tasks, we expect students to transform ideas from the sources to their own writing. So the question for us is how we account for this transformation in terms of the different criteria of a writing performance. For example, in terms of the content, in terms of the language, in terms of the organizational structure, the level of coherence, and also like acknowledgement of sources. So we have to translate student skills into the different descriptors. So one very good example of holistic integrated scales is the one developed for TOEFL IBT integrated tasks. It's a holistic scale from 1 to 5. You can go through the link to look at the whole rating scale. Here I'm just showing you the middle band 3. So it's a holistic scale, but it actually covers the different constructs we expect students to do in the task. For example, so students at this level are expected to incorporate important information from the lecture, but also show the connections between the reading text and the listening input. However, students at this level, some of the connections they make may be imprecise, and they may miss some of the major points. So, for example, the connections or the key points, some of them may be imprecise or inaccurate, and there might also be some errors of grammar or sentence structures. So if you're interested, if you're interested in holistic scales, please go to TOEFL's website to look at the scale. So, and then after you have decided whether you want to use a holistic scale or an analytic scales, then the next question is about the levels, the number of levels you have to be able to differentiate, and the numbers of bands, and how will your descriptors look like. So when you draft the descriptors, these are some of the useful materials you can refer to. For example, the CEFR descriptors that I have mentioned earlier. If you're working to improve an existing rating scales, like in the example of the ISC test, then obviously you should refer to the previous rating scales of the test. If you're working to develop a brand new rating scale, it's useful to look at other established rating scales. And it's also useful to look at the literature, to look at what people have found out about the language features at different level, or at the level that you are working with. Another useful source of evidence is the actual scripts produced by your students. So by analyzing some sample scripts, you will be able to identify like the features that distinguish your stronger performance from the weakest performance. And also you might be able to select some examples to explain what you mean for each descriptor. And this is going to be very useful when you do rating training later on. So just to give you a very brief idea of what people have found in the literature about the different features of integrated performance. For example, in terms of content, researchers have found that for higher scoring performance, students tended to be able to include ideas from all sources, and they were able to summarize ideas from the sources. Whereas lower scoring students, they mainly include idea from one source only. So they rely on one of the texts rather than all the sources. And usually they generate content based on their own previous knowledge rather than from the sources. And in terms of languages, in terms of language, so stronger performance would show evidence of paraphrases, whereas a weak performance usually consisted a lot of direct copies from the sources. And in terms of organization, higher scoring performance usually had a more appropriate organization, whereas a lower scoring performance tended to just follow maybe the structure of one of the sources, even if it is inappropriate to the writing task. And for the last one, acknowledgement of sources, this is particularly relevant for texts in the academic context. So is to see whether students are able to make references appropriately. So from in the literature, people have found that, okay, high scoring students, they were able to indicate or reference sources properly, whereas the weaker performing student couldn't. So these findings are very useful for us when we developed the ratings, the descriptors to describe what we expect students to perform. So this is the example of ISC. So let me just remind you, ISC is a high stakes examination. The scores are being used for visa application purposes. So there's a expectations of providing very vigorous descriptions of the level of student and what they are able to do. So based on the need of the test, this is what the scale is aiming to do. So there are 4 analytic criteria: reading for writing, task performance, organization and structure, and language control. So the first one is used only for the integrated task, whereas the other 3 are shared between the integrated task and the independent task. But today I'm going to focus only on the first criterion, reading for writing. So for each of these categories, there are several subcategories. So for reading for writing, we expect to assess how well students can understand the source materials, how well they can select relevant content from sources, and assess students' ability to identify common themes and links within and across the multiple texts, and how well they can adapt or transform the content from the sources to the purpose of their writing, and lastly, how well they can paraphrase and how well they can summarize. So for each of these subcategories, we developed descriptors to describe what students can do at different levels. So for each of the categories, there are 4 bands of descriptors, from 1 to 3 to 4, where band 3 indicate a good performance at the level. So if you're working with a test like this, it's recommended to start with the band at the level when you write your descriptors. So for example, you may want to define what student at this particular level can do. For example, if we are working with the B2 level, so you may start gathering evidence about what student at this level can do by completing your task. So in this particular example, we have produced these descriptors to describe a student at B2 level can do on the ISC 2 integrated task. So for example, students should show full and accurate understanding of the essential meaning of most source materials demonstrated. And then they will show the ability to select appropriate and accurate ideas from the sources. And they will be able to demonstrate the ability to identify the common themes, and they will show a good ability to adapt the contents from the sources, and lastly show good summarizing and paraphrasing skills. And you can see there are some additional explanation, if you like, to help raters to make a decision to distinguish whether students are at this band level. And when we developed the rating scales for ISC, we did some pilots and we collected feedbacks from the raters. And actually, we made use of the feedback from the raters to improve the descriptors by adding the blue, the text highlighted in blue here to improve the rating scales. And if you're interested, you can go through this link to look at the full scales. And for the second example, we are working for a different scenario for the UOB test. It is a test to be used within a single university. So for this test, we have developed 3 analytic criteria in terms of the content, the organization, and also the language. And the purpose of this test, let me remind you, is to provide a prompt assessment for all the students who are coming into this university to diagnose their strengths and weaknesses of their academic writing skills. So what we need to do is to distinguish students into 3 categories. So the first category are students who don't need any additional systematic support, whereas the second category are students who would benefit some systematic support of academic writing skills, whereas the last categories, we would like to identify students who really need quite a lot of support to improve their academic skills. So in terms of the content, instead of developing different subcategories, what we do here for this particular test is to provide a description of what we're expecting raters to assess in terms of content. So in this example, we're expecting, for this criterion, we're expecting to assess student ability to address the 4 points stated in the task rubrics. So in the task, so we ask student whether, we ask student to provide a title for their writing, to identify the issues from different sources, to summarize the ideas and explain which main idea is most significant and why. So in this particular category, we are looking to assess student abilities to do all these things, as well as the communicative effect of the writing. So the next step is to translate that into descriptors. So as I said, there are 3 bands. We use a traffic light system, so green indicate a free to go. So for a performance at band A, we are looking at a performance which is which address the 4 points fully and with some appropriate expansion, and also a performance that has a desired communicative effect on the target reader. So, and we work with this expectation, and then we describe the other 2 levels, like for students who need some support and for students who need a lot of academic writing support on this particular category. So after you have developed the rating scales, and from the 2 examples, you can see when you're developing a rating scale for different texts, the rating scales can look quite different at the end based on the different needs of the test. So the next step is to consider how you are going to report the score. So you have different rating descriptors, but the next step is how you are going to report the score. So are you going to report an overall score, or are you going to show students the different analytic scores? So in some high-stakes examination like ISC, so usually students are expected to receive a certificate or like a diagnostic profile of what they can do based on the assessment of the task. So if you're interested in what a diagnostic profile looks like, you can go to the Trinity's website. They have got some examples there. So and then we have to consider how you're going to give feedback to the students. So It is important to consider these not at the final step, because sometimes if you consider this at the final step, it will be too late. So it's important to bear this in mind when you start brainstorming how the rating scale should look like at the beginning as well. And the last consideration is how you are going to collect evidence to improve, to show that whether the rating scale is working in the direction you want it to work, and how you can improve your rating scales. So how we can do this is by, for example, analyzing the scores, the rating data, to analyze the rating, the raters processes, how raters make use of the rating scales. Do they have any difficulties? And another important source is the actual writing scripts. So what are the features? What are the features in the rating scripts are useful for making the distinctions between levels? And very important to gather some feedback from the raters or from the student when they receive the feedback. There are two main approaches of analyzing the rating data. So one is the classical test theory, and the second one is the multifaceted RATER'S analysis. It's really beyond the scope of today's webinars to talk about this in detail. But by looking at the rating data, we are looking at evidence of how well the different descriptors can discriminate different levels of the performance and rating reliability, and also whether there are variations in rating. For example, if you're working with a group of raters, would some of them be more linear than the others? And if you are working with different versions of a test, would there be variation between the versions or the writing mode, for example, paper-based versus computer-based? But apart from the score, it's also important to analyze the actual writing scripts. This is a very useful exercise. So you can ask your raters to rank some sample scripts into different piles. You can, at the beginning, you can start it with 2 levels. Maybe you can just ask your raters to rank the script into good, better performance than and weaker performance, and then from the 2 piles, you can select some good example and ask the raters to provide some explanations of why they think it is a better performance, and vice versa, why it is a weak performance. And you will find that description really helpful for you to refine your descriptors. Another approach to analyze the writing scripts is through an automatic text analysis tools. These are 3 very commonly used tools to analyze student the features of students' writing, including the vocab profile lexical tutor. So they will show the profile of vocabulary in student script, and Cometrics actually provides a wide range of indexes to analyze a text, and also text inspector. So if you're interested, please check their websites. They're all freely available. But here today, I want to focus a bit more on the commentaries by the raters. I myself find this exercise very useful in the process of developing a rating scales. So for example, in the example of ISE, so we asked a group of raters to sit down to discuss what they, to discuss their understanding of each of the criteria. By by summarizing their discussion, we were able to better define the different descriptors, because sometimes when you develop rating scales, you're thinking from the point of, for example, the constructs, but sometimes raters, most of the time, raters are able to give you feedback how to improve the descriptors. So for example, for selecting relevant contents from sources, this is actually from the discussion, the rater discussion, that they commented, okay, for weaker students, they tended to only make use of idea from one source, whereas the stronger students, they actually make use of ideas from different sources. And then also, like at lower level, candidates could find out if the same idea has been mentioned in more than one text. So in other words, they won't include like repetitive ideas. And then at higher level, students can actually create an intertextual structure for their writing. So here are some like descriptions from the point of view of the raters by using the draft of the descriptors. But we found this very useful to refine the descriptors. So we actually built in some of their feedback into the final descriptors. And it's also important to consider rater processes to understand how they arrived at a particular score and to understand their difficulties. I think I'm going to skip this. So I think lastly, I would just talk about some of the common challenges that raters face when working with the integrated scales. For example, they found it quite time consuming, especially at the beginning of the process, because they have to be familiar with the input text. And also sometimes they found it hard to distinguish the language produced by the student and the language from the sources, especially when they're working with lower level students. And sometimes it's difficult to determine how well an integration is. What do we mean by a good summary? What do we mean by a weak summary? And some of the common questions raters ask is how much copying is allowed, how much quotations are allowed. So it's important to understand, it's useful to understand their difficulties so that we can provide solutions to help them. So for example, what do we mean by inadequate? We actually means fewer than half of the relevant ideas are selected. So based on the feedback from the raters, we can address their difficulties by amending the rating scales. Okay, so just to conclude the webinar, these are the important aspects we have to bear in mind when we develop a rating scales. And even though I talk about them one by one, it doesn't mean that they are in a linear order, because very often we have to go back and forth to revisit the constructs, the approach, and the descriptors, and also don't wait until the end to collect feedback, because usually it's useful to collect even like informal feedback to during the procedures to improve your rating scales. Yeah, so I hope, so this is some useful references that will give you more idea of how to develop a rating scale for integrated tasks. And I hope you found this webinar useful, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sathena. That was excellent, very comprehensive, I think. We do have some time now for just a few questions. Somebody is asking if we can get the PowerPoint slides. Yes, they were very informative. With your permission, Sathena, we'll try to post those up on the EALTA website, if that's possible. After this webinar is finished in a few minutes, I will be sending everyone a link to the recording of this webinar, and hopefully if we can upload the PowerPoint slides as well, that would be excellent. We're getting some very good feedback here, Sathena, from your talk. Lots of people saying thank you, that it was really good and it was excellent. I'm just going to look at a few of the questions here. Okay, I've got one from Jen here, says, how do you determine where the multifaceted skills like source use fall into categories? For example, paraphrase certainly is demanding on lexis and grammar, but also has implications for organization and effective control. At what point was the decision made to put in language control, and how did you arrive there? Good question. Any responses to that one?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. And I think the important step is to translate the constructs that we want to measure in terms of into observable linguistic features, because we talked about summarizing, paraphrasing, all these processes. But the question is how we can identify these processes when we looked at the performance. So to decide on that is really based on a number of sources. First of all, we have to look at the literature of what people have found in the past, and also look at the actual scripts from your text to see whether you can identify the features of summarizing or paraphrases. And it also depends on the goal of your tests. And because, for example, for academic tests, sometimes we are not really dealing with the grammar in a way of like how accurate the sentence structure is. So when we talk about language at academic level, we're talking about the language of transforming from sources to their own writing. Yeah, so this is a short answer, but if you're interested, please look at, you can go to the references at the end of the PowerPoint slides, so that would give you more idea.
Okay, thanks, Sathena. One more kind of theme that's come up in a couple of questions is, again, it's about the incorporation of texts, and is incorporation a reading skill? Should it be given a separate reading score rather than purely a writing score? I think the common idea of the overlap between reading and writing, and where the distinction might lie, if you need to make a distinction.
Yeah, this is actually very interesting questions, because this comes up every time when we develop a rating scale for integrated tasks. And I think the answer, again, depends on the purpose of the test, whether you need to give a separate score on reading. If that is what you need to do for your test, then the step is really to tease out the reading abilities from the performance so that you can give a score on reading. But if that is not what you are, what you need to provide your student with, then you don't need a separate score for reading.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? So maybe I'll just ask one quick one of my own, actually, that I noted down while I was listening. I was wondering, it was interesting that you showed the CEFR levels for writing as a basis for rating scales and looking at levels, different levels of writing. I wondered if you think there's what kind of levels do integrated tasks perform best at? Do you think it's suited to higher levels, or can it be done at the lower levels? This is of personal interest to me.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think people tend to think that reading and writing skill doesn't kick in until students are at B1 or B2 levels. But I think one of the difficulties of working with integrated tasks is that we don't really have a coherent model of reading to writing as compared to writing and reading. So, I mean, we don't really have a lot of evidence of how writers, especially L2 writers, developed their reading to writing skills. But personally, I think that students do develop some reading to writing skills when they're at lower level. Because if you consider, for example, at an academic level, people may think that, okay, if students copy directly from the sources, it's plagiarism. But actually, some researchers argue that it may seem inappropriate in an academic context, but actually this is evidence of students developing reading and writing skills. So I think as in the field, we really need more evidence from research or from practice to improve our understanding of how L2 writers develop reading and writing skills.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we've just got time for a couple more quick questions that we've got here before we finish. So one from Valeria says, a common challenge I have when using rating scales with bullet points, like the second example you provided, is how many bullet points should I say yes to in order to say, yes, this is amber, or no, this is green? So what's the balance between if some things are true in one band and some things are true in the other band? At what point do we decide between bands? I think that's how I interpret this.
Yeah, I think when raters make the decision, it has to come back to the purpose of the test, because okay, the purpose of the test is to identify a student who needs help. So if you have a performance and you have identified a few weaknesses, so the question to guide this decision is, do you think that student would benefit like a lot academic support or some academic support? So I think that is the underlying principle to make that decision. So that's why it's important to consider the purpose of the test when we develop rating scales.
Okay. Good. I hope that answers your question, Valerie. Next, okay, let's maybe the last question. Yes, from Simon. And he says, okay, I was interested in your lit reviews suggested that drawing on multiple sources of reading content in the written response is associated with higher linguistic competence. So how sure can we be? He says, I wonder whether drawing on multiple sources could also be due to personality, interested in the big picture, or professional experience, more macro than micro-focused. Can you think of any ways that content writers can mitigate against this, e.g. in task rubric? Okay, that's interesting.
Yes, thank you for that. I think this relates to Richard's earlier questions about how we see students develop reading and writing skills. Because I think people tend to think that, well, obviously you have to have some level of linguistic competence in order to perform reading and writing tasks, but it also depends on what we're asking students to do, because at lower level, we may ask students to identify like factual ideas, whereas at higher level, we may expect students to summarize ideas in a coherent way. So it depends on the construct, what we're asking students to do in our task. Because I personally believe students at lower level can perform on reading to writing tasks, but be in the same sort of skills of integration we expect like academic writers can perform.
Okay.
And I think the second question, if I remember correctly, is how we translate this into the task rubrics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think it's important to, because we didn't really have time to talk about the task design, but it's important to specify what you expect students to do in the task rubrics. For example, do you expect students to make use of information from all the sources? Are you expecting them to just to identify key ideas or to summarize? So it's important to make that very clear in the task instructions so that students know what they are expected to interact with the input text, if you like. Because one of the previous research done by Flower et al. In the literature is that if you give a sort of like open-ended task to students, students would report very different understandings of what the task asks them to do. So from the point of view of task development, it's important to specify what we need students to perform.
Okay. Well, I hope that answers your question, Simon. Good.
Can I just add that because this is quite under research area. So if any one of you would love to share your experience or ideas or difficulties of working with integrated tasks, you're really welcome to email me, or if you have further questions, then yeah, I'm really happy to answer some of your questions through email. Yeah.
And if you really have a lot of questions, I'm sure you could apply to do a PhD at have Sathena as your supervisor. I think that's all the questions we've got time for at the moment. Sorry if anybody had any other questions which they would like to have asked, but please do email Sathena or myself if you have any other questions that you're particularly interested in. I'd like to thank Sathena once again for today's talk. I thought it was really fascinating, and I certainly learned a lot today, and I think from the feedback that we've had so far, I think a lot of other people have as well. So that was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
If anybody has any feedback about today's session, please send me an email. As I say, when this webinar does, when the recording does go up on the EALTA website, hopefully then I will send everybody an email with the link. Our next webinar will be in the spring, we hope, and our topic is and speaker as yet undecided. So watch this space for further news. If you do have any questions then about this, then please do send them in. If you have any suggestions for what the topic of the next webinars could be, then please send those in as well. I think we're going to sign off now. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. We had very good attendance today. We had up to 100 people throughout the webinar. So thank you everybody for taking the time, and we hope to see you again at the next EALTA webinar next year. So from me, from Sathena, goodbye.
Goodbye.